As we plunge deeper into 2022, the hope of new AMD APUs is on the horizon, promising new and improved integrated RDNA 2 graphics. But will they be worth it compared to the cost of an entry-level GPU like this here GTX 1050 Ti? Hello and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the GTX 1050 Ti, a budget GPU from 2016, back when budget meant something. Yes, up until recently, this was one of the best low-end options for an entry-level, low-power GPUs, only being surpassed by the 1650 Super, but that was also relatively more expensive than it, especially during this crisis. The exact card we have here today in question is the Asus Phoenix model. It's one of the more basic models, with a small heatsink and a single fan design. It isn't the most glamorous looking cooler, but we'll have to see how the cooler performs later on. Under the heatsink, we have the GPU die itself, a GP107. It's based on the Pascal architecture and comes equipped with 768 CUDA cores, 48 TMUs, 32 ROMs, and 4GB of GDDR5 memory on a 128-bit memory bus. It has a base clock of 1291 MHz with a boost clock of 1392 MHz and a memory clock of 1752 MHz. The card's outputs consist of an HDMI 2.0 port, a DisplayPort 1.4 port, and a DVI port, enabling a full triple monitor setup. On the bottom, we have a PCI Express 3.0 16x slot for connecting to your motherboard. First off, I'd like to mention the noise levels of the card. As it is a single fan design, you might expect it to be quite loud, but you'd be dead wrong. At idle, it is noticeable above the CPU fan and the other fans in my system, as the cooler doesn't stop spinning, but it wasn't that annoying, and when under load it was barely noticeable over the rest of the fans in my system. Take a listen. This was with the stock fan curve, which keeps the card at a nice and cool temperature of around 65 degrees when gaming and 70 degrees when under extreme load like FurMark. This was in my Phanteks P360A with a very quiet fan profile for the front fans, so keep that in mind for your builds. One of the nice things about this card in particular is the small size and measly 75W TDP without a requirement for a PCI Express power connector. Thanks to that, it can be thrown in basically any PC that has full-size PCIe slots, and even some that don't. This is my server. It's an old HP thin PC that I picked up a few months back off eBay, and the other day I had a friend that was coming over and we wanted to play some games together. So I took my Dremel and cut the back out and took a PCI Express riser and managed to fit the card in it with a bit of finagling. The card itself was fine, but the cooler shroud was a bit too large, so I had to remove it to make it fit. But after that, I had a nice little gaming PC with this 1050 Ti. And that is often quite a big draw for these cards, because they were relatively cheap, had low power draw, and were often quite small, some even being low profile variants, making them perfect for office PC conversions. But it doesn't matter how well they fit if they don't have the performance to back it up. So let's see how it performs with some benchmarks. Before we start the benchmarks, I just wanted to mention that they were taken before the recording, as the recording typically knocked off about 10 FPS. First up, we have Doom Eternal. This was run at 1080p, set to low, but with high textures, medium shadows, and all depth of field effects turned off, and it achieved an average of 59 FPS with 1% lows of 38 FPS and 0.1% lows of 22 FPS. It was a very enjoyable experience, and I actually forgot that I was recording and have way too much footage for this short segment. A really good experience to start off with. Hitman 2 was up next, and at 1080p medium settings, it achieved an average of 47 FPS on the built-in benchmark, with 1% lows of 25 FPS and 0.1% lows of 16 FPS. Due to Hitman's slower nature, this is a perfectly playable frame rate, but if you want more of a 60 FPS experience, low settings could be used. Halo Infinite was run at 1080p with an 85% resolution scale on the low settings, and with these settings it achieved an average FPS of 57 with 1% lows of 50 FPS and 0.1% lows of 44. Those averages sound okay, but I think there are some frame time issues, as it did not feel like it was that smooth. Halo has a feature that gives you a minimum FPS target, which is like a resolution scale. I prefer a locked resolution scales, as I've had bad experience with variable ones in the past, but don't let that stop you from trying it. Next, we tested Fortnite at 1080p medium settings, and it achieved an average of 80 FPS, with 1% lows of 30 FPS, and 0.1% lows of 10 FPS. These moments of stutter were from the beginning of the game on the Battle Pass and were not representative of gameplay most of the time, as it was more like that 80 FPS most of the time. You could probably even crank up to high and simply good. Next up, Control. It was run at 1080p on the low settings and achieves an average of 54 FPS with 1% lows of 43 FPS and 0.1% lows of 16 FPS. So once again, a pretty decent showing from the 1050 Ti. For those more competitive games, we have CSGO, which was run at 1080p on the low settings and achieved an average of 200 FPS on the community benchmark map. So if you wanted to use an 144Hz monitor with this card, you could, and it would actually be useful for those more competitive titles like CSGO, Valorant, League of Legends, those kind of stuff. BeamNG Drive on the normal preset at 1080p achieved an average of 50 FPS on the jungle map and more like 70 FPS on some of the simpler maps. The 1% lows on the jungle map were 32 FPS and 0.1% lows were 1 FPS, but that was from loading in the map and not actual gameplay. Now for some ray tracing. Well, sort of. Here we have Teardown on the lowest settings at 1080p and it achieved an average of 28 FPS with 1% lows of 20 FPS and 0.1% lows of 14 FPS. Thanks to a consistent frame rate, this game was perfectly playable in the 1050 Ti, but just know that when you destroy a lot of stuff here, there will be slowdown no matter what happens. Following along with the ray tracing theme, Minecraft 1.18.1 with shaders. It was run at 1080p on the fancy settings with 2 shaders and a render distance of 12 chunks. With these settings, it achieved an average of 43 FPS with 1% lows of 30 FPS and 0.1% lows of 20 FPS. Another decent showing from the 1050 Ti. Lastly, we have Unity in Heaven, and on my normal benchmark we have a score of 1664 with an FPS of 66, and on my extreme benchmark we have a score of 887 with an FPS of 35, putting it nearly triple the power of the Vega 8 in the Ryzen 3 3200G, and about half the speed of the 980 Ti, about where it scores in performance actually. As part of having my card in the system, I decided to play some VR games. While not recording any of the performance numbers, I can say it felt very good while playing Pavlov and Beat Saber, with not much slowdown or stuttering, any more than usual I mean. So if you want to try some VR on the 1050 Ti, then go ahead, because it will perform fine for most games. So that's the 1050 Ti, and as you can see from these benchmarks, it still holds up fine as a little 1080p low/medium gaming card. But what about pricing? I've deliberately avoided talking about pricing throughout this video, as I actually borrowed this card from a friend, and from what I've seen on pricing online, it's just stupid. The card usually goes for around 130 to 160 on eBay, which is far too expensive for this card. I know the market is very messed up now, but just 70 extra pounds, I've seen 1070s and 1080s on Facebook Marketplace, which vastly outperform this card. I would say only go for this card if you can find it for under that £100 mark, as when you start getting to that 150 mark, 970s and 980s start becoming available readily. And I know they also are getting scalped to hell, but they will outperform the 1080 Ti hands down. And I often see them for under 150, so just be careful when you're looking. So unless you have a deal on the 1050 Ti, just avoid it right now. The inflated pricing really ruins any value this card has. It's still a fine performer, but just a hard one to recommend. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any thoughts, please leave them down in the comments below. Please remember to like and subscribe, so that we feed that sweet, sweet, sweet YouTube algorithm. So yeah, see ya.